So thank you again for being here to talk to me today about human synergistics, our ideas and concepts, and how they connect to the topic of psychological safety in organizations. So before we get to all of that, I thought we need a little introduction of what is psychological safety. What are we talking about? So the term psychological safety is not actually as new as it might seem. The concepts of psychological safety have been researched since the 1960s, and many additional pieces of research have been done more recently, recognizing not only what is psychological safety, but the importance of it and how that has a really powerful influence on things like employee engagement, satisfaction, ability to think creatively, ability of teams and groups to be innovative, learn from mistakes, so on and so forth. So the definition, or at least one of them I came across, is that we're talking about this in terms of a person's anxiety about being accepted and seen as worthwhile in an organization. So psychological safety has been shown, is being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequences or self-image. So that's sort of the initial concept. Why that matters, again, I'm referring to some of those other research pieces that have been done previously. I know there was a large study done by Google recently that also confirmed a lot of these findings. Harvard Business Review has done studies finding very similar things as well. So the higher levels of psychological safety that we're able to encourage and create within our teams and organizations is typically associated with things like higher level of collaboration and information sharing, higher levels of personal satisfaction and engagement amongst members, greater learning transfer. So in those, again, work environments where people feel safe, they can speak up when they see something that concerns them. They can speak up when they have a good idea, even if it seems different than what other people are thinking, or maybe different than what we've done historically. And we're able to thereby, share more information, be open to new ideas. And this is part of the reason that we see higher learning transfers in those sorts of teams and organizations, more creative and innovative ideas, adaptive ideas. I think this is part of the reason that psychological safety is such a topic today, because many organizations are very focused on creating a workplace that's more adaptive, innovative, creative, and so on. And they may recognize that factors around psychological safety are preventing their people from being as creative and providing as much as they potentially could. Higher success rates for innovative projects. So sort of when we try new things, how effectively we're able to actually do that is influenced by psychological safety. And then it also has other effects, things like lower levels of stress. If I feel that I'm able to sort of be my genuine self and not be judged by my ideas and so on, then I feel that I'm able to fit in. This has to do with social fit, we'll talk about in a moment, but helps people to reduce their level of stress, social anxiety, feel that they fit in more effectively, and again, reduce stress and burnout over time. So those are part of the reasons that organizations, leaders are interested in psychological safety. The next question is sort of how is this measured? Of course, looking online, there are some pretty straightforward ways to get an idea of psychological safety in your organization. And a lot of times I found just simple items, questions being included that could be asked to employees. So these are things like, if you make a mistake in your team, is it held against you? Are you able to bring up problems and tough issues? Do people in the team sometimes reject others' ideas as being different? And is it safe to take a risk? Just a few example sorts of ideas and items to capture this concept. That's helpful, and I hope that's useful to understand what we're talking about and why it matters, and the sorts of questions we might ask to understand, how people are feeling about psychological safety in our organization today. But like a lot of other things, and this is a part of why I like to do these Wednesday discussions, is I think it's important to take these concepts and put them into a larger concept and construct so that we can understand where does this fit in our organization, how does it play out, if we see poor levels of psychological safety, what might we need to do differently, those kinds of questions. So let's put that into a little bit of context of human synergistics, how culture works model. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with our model that we use to look at organizations in terms of organizational culture and outcomes. I've described this model in other sessions, and that's not particularly the point of today's discussion. So I'll go through this with the assumption that you're familiar with this model. If not, feel free to reach out to us. We also do have videos and other materials that help to explain. When we think about psychological safety, for those people who are familiar with these concepts, one of the most frequent questions that we get is, where does this fall within the how culture works model? Is psychological safety an aspect of business climate in terms of how we do things and the systems and structures employed? Is psychological safety another word for organizational culture? Is that what we're looking at when we understand psychological safety? Is that another way to understand culture? Or is psychological safety perhaps an outcome, those well-being and performance criteria that we find are causally influenced by things like organizational culture? I'll actually give you two answers today, but I'll start with the primary answer from my side, and that would be that psychological safety actually falls under the outcome category. It has to do with primarily the psychological well-being of people within these teams and organizations, and those measures of psychological well-being are primarily influenced by organizational culture and thereby are described as being outcomes. I included the definition for, or our little statement for, what is psychological safety. I also included a couple examples of questions that human synergistics has been asking for decades that are psychological safety questions. So the OCI was developed in the late 1970s, early 1980s. These ideas around psychological safety were present, and we included those concepts in this model. Specifically, asking these two questions, I think, are the most direct connections. The first, to what extent must you think differently in order to fit into this organization? This is one of the most commonly confused outcome items that we ask in OCI. It's under the individual outcomes, and it's really what we describe as a measure of social fit, the extent to which people feel that I can be my genuine self, I can bring myself to work, and my unique ideas and perspectives will be accepted and I'm able to fit in. So I think that's a very, very close analogy to what's being described in terms of psychological safety. The other item that we're capturing out here in outcomes as a standard item in our instruments has to do with a simple question around, to what extent do you feel that you're able to comfortably fit in as a member of this organization? And that, again, has a lot to do with concepts of psychological safety and social fit. So not only do we ask those kinds of questions, but our clients, as I mentioned before, are also interested in psychological safety. And before I get to that, and what that means is we can customize in part the outcome criteria that we assess in these instruments. So while we always ask questions around individual performance and well-being, we also ask questions around teams and groups and how they function and perform in an organization. And we also ask questions about the organization itself, how it services customers, the quality of its goods, services, and so on. Because when we understand organizational culture, we really then understand that those patterns that play out in culture influence not only the individuals in your business, but the groups and teams and how they work together and how they solve problems and get things done. And ultimately, those patterns drive the organization in terms of things like its ability to, and these are questions that we ask, adapt to changing needs of customers or the workplace. So organizational adaptability, very, very important, obviously, and things like ability to serve customers effectively, quality of products, and so on. Having said that, we're able to customize these outcomes and add additional well-being or performance criteria to the instrument. And not only that, meaning not only measure those custom questions that your organization may have around psychological safety, but we can also give you very good correlation analyses to understand what the culture of the business is as well, and how those patterns in the culture are influencing or driving psychological safety in your business. To make this clear, I used an example. So this is an anonymized client data set, and I like it because these are over here on the left-hand side, these are custom outcome items that the client included, and a lot of them have to do with well-being, psychological safety, and inclusion and diversity, which is pretty closely related. So I very much like these items. We have things like, do you enjoy coming to work? I'm confident in the future success of the company. Leaders make me proud to be a member of this organization. The culture is one that enhances employee commitment. Do people treat each other with respect, regardless of their diverse styles, perspectives, and opinions? The next two I'm going to focus on a little bit because I think they're very important. So does this organization encourage an environment where people value individual differences, aspects of diversity, including gender, ethnicity, nationality, so on and so forth. So this is a very nice diversity and inclusion type of outcome question. The one that I've highlighted in red is our real psychological safety item. I think in this case, we're asking, is it safe to speak up at work? Pretty clear, straightforward question around psychological safety. Good. So what we find when we ask those kinds of questions of employees in an organization and separately assess organizational culture and those patterns, and that's the blue, red, and green styles across here that we're talking about. Now we're beginning to understand not only how the level of psychological safety your people are reporting, essentially, but what is contributing to that and influencing that. So if I can move out of the way here, you'll see that. And again, if you're not familiar with human synergistics models, this might seem a little surprising, but for those of you who are, hopefully it won't. What I mean is that when we look at these outcomes, you actually find that all of them are positively, sorry for the video issue, positively correlated to constructive behavioral patterns, which means when we look at organizational culture, the more constructive behavior that is taking place, and I'll give some examples of this in a moment, the more constructive behavioral norms are taking place in an organization, the more highly people respond to all of these items. Therefore, if we want people to feel more safe and improve diversity and inclusion and so on and so forth, then we should logically be promoting those blue constructive patterns that promote those sorts of well-being and performance criteria. Unfortunately, secondarily, the what we call the passive and aggressive patterns, the red and green styles that we assess within organizational culture, these are what we call security oriented, and they do tend to have unfortunately, a negative effect, and that's very much what we find here as well within this client data set. All of the defensive behavioral patterns have a negative and actually a very consistently negative influence on these kinds of outcome criteria, meaning the more red and green behavior within your organization's culture, the more defensive the culture becomes, the lower people will describe every one of these outcomes, especially including, by the way, psychological safety has some of the strongest and most consistent correlations. So especially things like diversity and inclusion and psychological safety. If we want a little more detail, we can dig into that and even find out which patterns are most influential. So the patterns that tend to be most positive in driving psychological safety, for those of you who are familiar with human synergistics models, this will be sort of an aha moment because the number one is self-actualizing, and that makes a whole lot of sense. Self-actualizing patterns are all about being your unique self, being able to be creative, approach work in new ways, learn from mistakes. That is a kind of a behavioral pattern that requires psychological safety to be able to experiment, try new things, be unique, speak up, experiment, and so on. So it really is self-actualizing cultural patterns that most dramatically encourage a psychologically safe work environment. Secondarily, hopefully this isn't too big of a surprise, the second constructive factors that come into effect are, in order, are humanistic, encouraging, and affiliative patterns. Those are our constructive interpersonal patterns. So if we think about psychological safety under the definition that we started with, it really has to do with the sense of security, social security people feel within the organization. If we're using healthy interpersonal behavioral patterns, humanistic, encouraging, and affiliative, that bodes well for people reporting that we are feel safe and secure, because we're doing things in those patterns like listening to one another, empowering each other, considering alternatives, being open to other people's input. And it's that kind of culture where people feel that they're able to most easily fit in, they feel accepted, and they feel psychologically safe. What works against this? Well, we can also answer that as well. To be honest with you, from a data perspective, not a lot of surprises here. Not only do all of the defensive behaviors detract from psychological safety, but the ones that detract most consistently and most negatively are passive styles. And we have things like conventional, dependence, and avoidance. I'll give you some examples of this as we move forward so that you can see why those patterns may actually are the reason that organizations unintentionally create psychological insecurity and how that is. And I hope to do that on the next slide. So some examples. On the far left or right-hand side here, we have some of those measures of psychological safety we were talking about. Your ability to fit in, ability to speak up. Do you feel safe to speak your mind, share your unique ideas, viewpoints, and so on? So while that is an outcome, it's most dramatically influenced by these sorts of patterns. So self-actualizing was the strongest and most positive in its effect. And we have behaviors within the self-actualizing style, like think in unique and independent ways, maintain personal integrity, be open about self, and resist conformity. So if this is a team or an organization where we are encouraged to work and work together in those ways, that suggests more positive results when we look, hopefully this is making some sense, when we look and ask people about their level of psychological safety. Secondarily, if we want to look at what within our culture may be getting in the way of creating the kind of psychologically safe workplace we would like, then we're finding that those counterproductive patterns, again, in the red and green styles. I've gone in and identified a few items. So the most negative passive behavior was conventional within this client's data set that was undermining psychological well-being. So it's things like never challenging superiors, trying to be a good follower, accepting goals without questioning them, and following orders, even if they're wrong and even if we sort of know better. Those patterns, if this is what we're encouraged to do, it tends to, again, be negative. It's in its effect. Hopefully you can see the fact that this is going to actually be creating psychological insecurity. I need to do what my leaders tell me. I need to go along with others. I need to accept what I was told and not question it. So the ability for me to bring my unique self to this situation, contribute my unique ideas, is obviously mitigated by that pattern of culture, and not only reduces safety, but really creates a sense of psychological unsafety as a result. I also went in and pulled out a few other items I thought were sort of interesting to point to. Sorry, let me try to get out of the way. So these are from other defensive styles, but I think they're good examples because it makes a lot of sort of logical sense that the more of these things that we encourage in a culture, the less psychological safety we may see. So items from, for example, perfectionism, where we have an organization in which we can never make mistakes. Mistakes are not tolerated in that kind of context. Then people are afraid to speak up if they see mistakes happening, so on and so forth, obviously. Competitive cultures in which we're encouraged to win against one another, that is another great way to create insecurity in the team or organization. The more members are recognized that their motivations and their goals are inconsistent with one another, and for me to get ahead in this business, it means other people must lose, sort of a win-lose framework within the organization or team, that tends to have a negative effect on the psychological safety of people within those teams and businesses. We have patterns around opposing new ideas, criticizing the ideas and input of other people. There's also items around resisting new ideas, rejecting ideas that seem different or unique or creative. Obviously, those kinds of patterns, if they're playing out in the organization's culture, are going to have a pretty dramatic and negative effect on our ability to report we're psychologically safe. So hopefully this is making some sense, not only in terms of where psychological safety falls, but what kind of cultural patterns, what kind of behavioral styles, leaders or teams should be exhibiting in order to promote psychological safety, as well as those things that may be getting in the way. This is the kind of cause and effect and data-driven models that we use in HS to help organizations not only understand psychological safety, but why it is the way that it is and what needs to be done in order to grow and improve. So let's move to that next step. Hopefully now there's a separate topic to have, to be honest with you, within the circumplex. So again, if you're familiar with human synergistics tools or you're accredited in them, you will also recognize there is some psychological safety sort of built into our model. The top of the model is talking about psychologically satisfaction-oriented needs. So that's referring to a great extent to concepts along Maslow's hierarchy of higher order satisfaction-oriented needs around learning, growth, development, trying new things, being open to new ideas. These are psychologically safe patterns versus psychologically insecure patterns as we move down to the security-oriented patterns toward the bottom. And you can really see that within the description itself. We're motivated from a sense of security and need to avoid and resist what may be threatening or dangerous as perceived by employees. So there is an aspect of psychological safety within our model, certainly, and that would be the vertical dimension of satisfaction versus security orientation. Having said that, this is culture, not psychological safety. I guess the way I would describe this is that these are patterns, the blue toward the top, that if we can encourage and reinforce and role model these kinds of patterns within our organization, these patterns will promote and have a positive effect upon the psychological well-being of our people. The patterns toward the bottom of the model are the other way around, and the more of those patterns are playing out, the more this will tend to undermine or detract from the psychological well-being of our people. So psychological well-being is an outcome, but it is very strongly predicted by the kind of healthy, goal-oriented, and collaborative or insecure patterns that we encourage in our organization's culture. If that makes sense, then that actually leads us backward one additional step in our model. If we want a psychologically safe workplace and we understand to do that, and I included this profile here because this is the type of profile that we find consistently predicts the highest levels of psychological safety in organizations, those where the culture is primarily satisfaction and not security oriented. The question really then becomes, how do we create this kind of culture? The kind of culture that is healthy for human beings to work within, predicts high levels of psychological safety, but also predicts other positive outcomes we would bring attention to, like the ability to perform effectively, teams to work effectively, and the organization to function as a system effectively. And that really requires taking a step back in the model to look at organizational climate, how we've structured this organization, and how those structures and leadership factors are influencing the organization's culture. I know this is a lot, but let me try to add one additional piece. So in the very beginning of this presentation, we talked about what is psychological safety and why does it matter and how is it measured? And I focused on some of these later items here to talk through. I sort of skipped the first one. Are you able to bring up problems and tough issues? Do people in the team sometimes reject others' ideas for being different? And is this a safe place to take a risk? Those are very much outcomes in our model. However, the first is not. If you make a mistake in your team, is it held against you? That is actually a factor of organizational climate. It's not referring to the effect, it's referring to an extent to the cause. Why are people feeling psychologically unsafe? What are the systems, practices, structures within this organization that are undermining the psychological safety of people? And this is a good example. If the organization is effective in recognizing when employees make mistakes and consistent in giving them some kind of negative feedback or punishment associated with those mistakes, that has an effect. But interestingly, it doesn't have a direct effect on psychological safety. So this is sort of the extra piece I want to communicate. If you've seen my discussions about other topics like engagement or creative and innovative thinking or diversity and inclusion, one of the things I try to do when I talk about those topics is help people to understand where they fall within that organizational system model so that we understand sort of what it is and how to affect it. One of the things I consistently see when I'm talking about those other topics, again, psychological safety, engagement, service, leadership, whatever it may be, is confusion around that. So let me try to give you this point. The point that was just made in the previous slide, the question of if you make a mistake, will there be consequences? That again is a measure of organizational climate and something we've been looking at for a very long time and look at consistently within organizations. It has to do with what we call aspects of feedback and appraisals and reinforcement systems. And basically, we are asking those kinds of questions. If you make a mistake or do not meet expectations, what is the likelihood that anyone's going to notice? And if they notice, what's the likelihood that you're going to get some kind of punishment, whatever the form may be? Secondarily, we also ask questions, by the way, about positive reinforcement. Things like if you meet or exceed expectations, if you do great work, again, what is the likelihood that anyone is going to notice? And if they notice, what's the likelihood that you're going to get any kind of positive reinforcement for that? That is a balance of positive versus negative feedback in an organization that we measure with a few factors within here. That balance, sort of how much the organization focuses on and communicates negative feedback versus positive feedback, is an aspect of climate. But it has a very predictable influence on the kind of culture that you can expect within the organization. Feedback appraisal systems are one of my favorite climate factors to talk about because it's clear that they are not culture, but it's also fairly clear how that sort of practice can influence organizational culture. So the big picture really is that if we want a workplace that's psychologically safe, we need to create a culture that's primarily constructive, especially along the lines of self-actualizing and constructive interpersonal behaviors, so that people recognize that we value them, we're interested in their input. We do expect for them to think creatively. We do expect for them to speak up when they see a better idea or see a problem. We want to hear from them. And it's that kind of culture that people not only report problems and perform more effectively, but report that they're more psychologically safe, by the way, also more engaged, satisfied, experience less burnout and stress, less conflict amongst members, and so on. If this culture is then the topic of the focus of what we want to develop, then we need to move and understand how we create that. I like this example of, well, if we want psychological safety, we need to look at whether we're catching everybody's mistakes and pointing them out. That is part of it, but now hopefully you can see that's a very incomplete picture. Most organizations, if they go in and start changing these kinds of feedback and appraisal systems in order to be more positive, in order to affect psychological safety, they will tend to be disappointed. This is the kind of development out of context that tends to have unexpected effects. And the reason that understanding an organization in a more complete systemic manner is most helpful. It's really the fact that the organization focuses on what our employees are doing well and giving them positive feedback for that. That is not encouraging psychological safety. What it's actually encouraging is the kind of culture that we talked about previously. If we focus on what you're doing well, communicate and recognize and reward that as positive, If we also recognize where you may be failing, but rather than criticizing and giving negative feedback, we mainly try to focus the feedback on development. How can we learn from this? How can you do things better? If that's the system that we've designed in the organization, then the message people will get psychologically about how they are expected to approach their work will include those creative, curious factors, and also the constructive interpersonal factors around being able to listen to other people's ideas, being a safe place to speak up and share. And it's that kind of work environment that people describe as psychologically safe, and motivating and engaging. The important point here is that while, yes, this is a factor that's important, from our perspective, human synergistics, it really, all of these factors are important. Adjusting how we give feedback to employees is not the answer to psychological safety, and really that piece alone is not psychological safety. What we need to understand is how the organization is designed systemically, how those factors are influencing culture. If it's self-actualizing, we need to be psychologically safe, then we need to review the organization and its practices, not only reward systems. I can go through all 31 of them. We don't have the time, and give you examples of how these things done in what we call restrictive ways will undermine the ability of the culture to be constructive. It's not just negative feedback. For example, if goals are unclear, that creates a sense of insecurity amongst members. I don't know where we're going. I'm not sure how I contribute. I'm not sure what better is. I'm not sure what we're moving toward. In that kind of culture where I don't know how to apply myself and where we're going, I will tend to report lower levels of psychological safety because I don't know what the objective is. I don't know what good work is. I don't know necessarily what a mistake is within that context. It's not really because necessarily of goals. It's because of the pattern that is playing out in this organization culturally as a result of goals, feedback, leadership, job design, and the other systems within the organization. Those climate factors drive culture, and it is culture that drives outcomes. What we see in this example in the very beginning, first slide, is what I most often see, and that is a topic that is outcome-based, like engagement, psychological safety, creative, innovative thinking, and then we immediately hear best practices for creating that. Give more positive feedback, more inclusion, different job designs, collaborative goals, so on and so forth. While those things are true and likely possible options for improving these kinds of outcomes, the reason that those solutions don't systemically work in most cases is because we forgot about this piece in the middle. And that's also what we see when we look at the descriptions of psychological safety. It's described as an aspect of well-being, and it is created by climate. And we've lost in that description is organizational culture, and the fact that what's truly, and we can demonstrate this in data, what's truly most strongly influencing psychological safety is the culture. To change the culture, we need to understand climate. And it's that broader perspective and more complete picture that I think our clients benefit from, and explains why they're able to affect psychological safety very positively by addressing organizational culture. And they're able to address and shape culture because we give them very good detailed data around what factors the climate and leadership need to change and are holding us back from creating the kind of culture that is psychologically safe. That may be your feedback and appraisal systems, but it could be all sorts of other things. And in every organization, in my experience, every organization is different. And therefore, it's sort of a risk to guess that it's feedback alone that is going to help psychological safety. It's much more important to look at an organization as what it is, a complex social system, but within that complexity, we can understand how things are playing out in a cause and effect relationship, and we can understand what we need to do differently to create the kind of culture that not only drives psychological safety, but positively affects the well-being and performance of our people, teams, and organization. All right, so that was a lot of everything. I hope that makes some sense in terms of what is psychological safety, why it matters, where it falls within this kind of organizational system model. And if we see issues with psychological safety, or we want to affect this and change that kind of outcome criteria, that we need primarily to understand organizational culture, and secondarily climate, so that we can take the kind of actions to create the kind of workplace that works the way that we say it should, and all of our members feel that they're able to contribute, fit in, and perform at their best. Good. That is my 2 cents on psychological safety. I hope this was helpful. Thank you for taking part.